Every year, the National Urban League releases its highly anticipated report on the state of Black America. The report has become the national touchstone for the social and economic status of African American and Hispanic communities. The centerpiece of the state of Black America is the National Urban League Equality Index. The Equality Index summarizes how well African Americans and Hispanics are doing compared to whites in the areas of economics, education, health, social justice, and civic engagement. Today, our esteemed guest will discuss key findings in this year's Equality Index. Joining me, Dr. Valerie Ralston Wilson, economist and vice president of the research for the National Urban League Policy Institute. How are you?
Great.
Now, this clearly was a great opportunity to be able to, very differently than you all have in the last 37 years, be able to take a 50-year snapshot at where we've come since the anniversary of the March on Washington. What did you find in this 50-year snapshot that surprised you, somebody that's well-versed on the numbers?
Sure. Well, it's been a great opportunity indeed to take this 50-year look at equality in America, and we focus specifically on education and economics because that's a big part of what the National Urban League does nationally. And what we found was that over that 50 years, we've had tremendous gains in educational opportunity, both in terms of how many people are graduating high school, how many students are enrolling in college, and even how many are graduating from college. What we have seen less progress in has been in economic outcomes. So for example, the unemployment rate gap has changed very little. The income gap has changed very little. And the home ownership gap has changed very little, especially relative to what we've seen in educational outcomes.
Well, and talk about that a little bit. I mean, what are the nuances that you're finding? Because I know that most of us, for the last 50-plus years, have been told that getting an education was the gateway to changing what unemployment opportunities we had, what kind of income we could earn, and where we could ultimately live. Is it that we were wrong, or that we haven't been doing something right? What are the nuances that really give us insight to why we've seen a shift in education, but not a shift in some of these other areas?
Well, that's still true. It is still important to get an education. We know that college graduates are 4.5 times less likely to be unemployed than people who dropped out of high school. So there are definite payoffs in terms of getting an education. We also know that people who have a college degree have higher earnings than those who don't. But what we haven't seen change in is the relative gap between blacks and whites in these areas. So while African Americans have ascended the economic ladder, you know, that's undisputable, we have not necessarily moved any closer to whites, especially in those areas I mentioned, unemployment, income, and
so at the end of the day, we're seeing blacks and whites getting the same education, but the disparities are remaining the same.
Yes.
And what, as you look at the numbers, are there core causes for instance, let's deal with unemployment. I mean, when we look at unemployment, we know that the unemployment index has not changed. What are the indicators showing us why this is happening?
Well, unemployment is interesting because when we observe the fact that that gap is persistent, that 2-to-1 unemployment rate gap hasn't changed or has changed very little in the last 50 years, what I wanted to do was to begin to pick that apart. So what are the things that we would expect to explain unemployment? So if we control for education, we know that affects whether or not you have a job. We control for experience. How long have you been in the workforce? If we control for what field you work in, what industry you work in, even if we control for all of that factors, that gap only closes by about 1/5. So we still have most of the gap remaining. And for me, the only explanation left at that point is that there is some persistence in terms of discrimination, in terms of access to opportunity. I know one of the things that people like to use today as one of the buzzwords is that people have access to different networks or lack access to a particular network that would allow them to gain access to employment and knowledge and information about various opportunities.
Well, with that, we clearly know that blacks have gained access to resources that traditionally they hadn't. That there are blacks that have climbed the ladder, and thus their families have been able to gain entrance to places they hadn't been before. So with that, are there regions of the country that we're seeing where some of these kind of opportunities have shifted and we've seen a climb where other areas of the country have not seen that same sort of access and thus affected the unemployment rate?
Well, there are some very interesting statistics that we pulled out by race. Again, that 2-to-1 gap is persistent regardless of what region of the country you live in. However, there are regions of the country where it's worse than 2 to 1. For example, in the Midwest, the gap is about 2.6 to 1. But in that region, we find that African Americans who have a college degree have an unemployment rate that's more similar to whites with a college degree in that region. On the other hand, the northeastern region of the country is where we see the smallest gap overall. But in that region of the country, college graduates actually have the widest disparity. So it's interesting. In the Northeast, the smallest disparity is between people with less than a high school degree. In the Midwest, the largest disparity is between people with only a high school degree. So we find that across the country in different regions and different areas of the country, even though overall we see the same gaps, we don't see it playing out the same way for people with different levels of education.
So as you're looking at this, is there anything that just stumps you? I mean, you've got these brilliant minds sitting at the table. You're looking at this 50-year snapshot of where we've come and where we need to go. Is there anything that just doesn't make sense as you all are looking at the numbers versus what you see when you look into the black community and you see us, in some cases, doing better than we ever have before?
I think the thing that stumps a lot of people is the fact that that 2 to 1 is persistent across the education scale. I think the perception is that if you go to school, you do everything you're supposed to do, you get a college education, then you should be doing as well as your counterparts.
So what's the doctor prescribing? I mean, at the end of the day, we look at these numbers, we see where we've been persistent. What do the numbers then indicate, or what does common sense then indicate to say, here's what we need to do over the next 50 years so that we can make a dent out of what really has statistically not changed?
Yeah, I think we continue to encourage our young people to get an education. It definitely opens doors. You do better with a college education than you do without one. But beyond that, I think that our nation needs to have and needs to continue to have really an honest conversation about race and the implications that race has in terms of economic outcomes in our society.
Is there an out-of-the-box X factor, though, that says, let's look at, have we been able to look at other communities as case studies and says, here's what they've done internally, even as they fought some other external factors, to be able to create a shift that the federal government and racism really won't change?
Well, I think what we see in terms of the disparity in unemployment between blacks and whites is unique to blacks and whites, especially as it relates to the research and the work that we've done for this publication. Because we also dissected that unemployment rate gap for Latinos versus whites. And what we found there, whereas all of those factors, education, experience, occupation, whereas all of those factors don't make a big difference for blacks, they do for Latinos. So within, for the Latino white unemployment rate gap, we find that if we equalize education, you close about 3/4 of that gap. So clearly, to me, that says that there's something specific about the racial dynamic between blacks and whites in America and the history that plays into that. I think that we can't ignore that history has brought us to this point and continues to influence the way that people think and the way that people interact
and speaks to the importance of why the Urban League does this and the work that has to happen afterwards. Thank you, Valerie, for joining us and participating in this discussion. Please, you all, share this web series with your social media friends and followers, and let's continue this solution session using hashtag SOBA13. Now it's time for you to get involved. This State of Black America web series is presented by AT&T. Thank you, AT&T, for your continued support of the National Urban League. We also thank Comcast for their production support of the State of Black America web series. Together, we're empowering communities and changing lives. Please, you can join me every Sunday from 5 to 7 on my digital show, The Intersection, at www.bliss.fm, or follow me on Twitter at Jeff's Nation. For more information on the State of Black America and to purchase the book, visit National Urban League at nul.org.
Hello, National Urban League. My name is Cynthia Marshall, Senior Vice President for Human Resources for AT&T. On behalf of our more than 240,000 employees, we're excited to support, for the third year, the National Urban League's State of Black America report and discussion. Our commitment to diversity is vital to the success of our company. For AT&T, an innovative, diverse, and competitive workforce ultimately begins with providing better educational opportunities for everyone. And that is why we remain supportive of the State of Black America's report. I am reminded of Maya Angelou's beautiful statement about all threads in the tapestry being equal in value, no matter what their color. Or the poignant words of Mikhail Gorbachev, that peace is not unity in sameness, but unity in diversity. For AT&T, this understanding of diversity's value is one of our bedrock convictions. Our partnership with you underscores our deep commitment to diversity and empowerment. And so today, we salute the National Urban League on another successful, substantive, and thought-provoking report. Job well done, Mark Morial.